I would like to tell you a story. A story that, more than not, helped me find inspiration out here. Um, so they sent us out here to figure out what happened to these people, and we've done that. People, people is an interesting word, but I can confirm that there was sentient life out here at one point. Just for a little synopsis for anybody that's been living under a rock out there, approximately 400 or 500 years ago, a probe, approximately 100 meters across, came barreling through our star system. One of the first to be colonized after the exodus from Earth, mind you. Um, we managed to snag it, uh, decipher their language, determine where it came from, and send a mission out to find them. My consciousness was created through artificial conception, but not how most people are artificially created. My mother was a biologic, but she was still artificially inseminated, but without any genetically modified sperm, actually. So if you're if you've never seen me before, and a lot of people are gonna see me after this report, yeah, perfectly biologic human. We still exist out there, and yes, we are conscious, you bastards. um, from what we could determine, these people were very much like us, carbon based, not a surprise, based off of the history we gathered from the probe listed on their laser discs. Yeah, laser disc on there. Um, we knew what they looked like too, which was cool. They included photography and stuff. I'm sorry if I'm a little scatterbrained. I just absorbed what we mostly recently learned about them, which I will get to. But I just want to preface that yeah. So we sent our own crude mission out here because that's how we do things, at least where I'm from. Uh, took us just 200 years. Took the probe itself about, we're estimating anywhere between 30 to 45,000 years to get to where we were. Um, um, yeah, 200 years. What am I freaking saying? No, they were only 10 light years away. So for us, that's 50 years worth of travel time. Um, for most of my friends, that was a quick jaunt. Uh, for me, of course, I'm 3 times older than I was when we left, is what I like to say. But this isn't about me again. Let me get back to the point. I'm sorry. It's just, it's difficult because you spend your life learning about these people. Like most of my young adult life was spent researching and studying um, these people. And to find out that they're gone, I mean, we suspected, but we weren't sure because the technological level left some room for error. Uh, basically, um, these bipedal, carbon-based, um, four-armed, three-appendaged, kind of a cross between scaly. It's very difficult. We're still trying to figure out more about their physiology. But from what they gave us, they did reach when the probe was sent out. They did have a pretty good understanding of their DNA. We're guessing they were about the CRISPR-Cas9 level of development when the probe was sent out. Uh, they had not quite scales, but not quite skin, uh, and They they were anywhere between 1.2 to 2.3 meters tall, depending on the diversity. Uh, Anywhere between 40 and 150 kilograms. They breathed oxygen. Um, eh, they had two genders. It's kind of ridiculous. We're wondering, honestly, if this is supporting that panspermia idea, but obviously now our sample size has gone from one intelligent species to two. So we're still got to study on that. But that's the hypothesis I'm backing up behind, is that we both came from the same panspermia because, as you may have heard me recently mention, they did have DNA. They had DNA. Like, that's pretty. What are the odds? That's pretty cool. They had vocal cords, which is probably how they got to this stage of civilization that allowed them to get this far. But it was a very interesting shape. It was closer to the shape of a bird, rather than a mammalian vocal cord. So very similar, but yeah. Anyway, enough about their physiology. Sorry, I don't. If you're confused as to why I'm making this so somber, I just so one of the things the Laserdisc included, and what was actually my major field of study for this project, was the xeno, well, xenoanthropology. Right? I still don't know what to call. It's been decades. I still don't haven't settled on a name. Xenopathology, pro, anthro, anthropology, xenopathology. Sure, why not? We'll just call it xenopathology for this report. Um, yeah. So my main focus was their history, right? Where they come from. Um, it's almost crazy how similar it is to our history. They had a dank river valley, or several, as but their history, actually, the only main difference is that their history is continuous. Um, they were actually, and obviously we don't know they didn't know their brain structure that well, so we don't know their brain structure that well. Um, their their brains had just a tiny bit less anger than ours, seemingly. At least that's my guess, because though there was wars and stuff, um, they never had like a major, like how we had brought the Bronze Age collapse and all that sort of stuff due to ecological factors. They didn't. Their world is actually even more habitable than Earth, and actually one of the most habitable planets we've found yet. Um, and uh, No, it allowed for kind of easy as it can get, Darwinian game going on. So they were very much more communal, kind of more closely related to our bonobos than us in that way. Um, so yeah, so their familial structure and all their traditions, all their kind of the lineage of their civilization is one straight line. Whereas with us, it's like, well, you had the Sumerians, and then you had the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans, and it's like they're all thousands of years apart. These guys had their predecessors. So they actually were able. They knew where agriculture first started. Um, Obviously, it started elsewhere on the planet, but in one particular valley on their second largest continent, kind of towards the northeast, um, it it well, agriculture started from the perspective of the probe, from when they sent the probe, 8,000 years ago. So they already had it on. They already had it on us on speed. It's like 8,000 years ago. So about um we'll get to how long ago that actually was. But from when they sent out the probe, so from their development of agriculture to when they sent the probe was 8,000 years. So that has us beat for that has us beat by like what, like 13,000 years. And I'm not even talking like, because for them, the domestication of grains and barley and that stuff, to just straight up farming and like agricultural communities was maybe 500 years. So that's already beating us by several thousand. I'm sorry, I'm very impressed by these people. Um, but getting to the point, their civilization rose pretty quickly there. Writing, the wheel, all within about 3,000-ish years. Um, the problem arises though in that their civilization was so communal and so and wars were so infrequent between these fiefdoms that by the time you get to what we would consider the kind of the our imperial age. So as I so quickly for context, as I briefly mentioned, one of the other places where agriculture developed was on the larger continent. And definitely during their age of colonialism and imperialism, there was discrimination and slavery and kind of their larger continent was like sort of a mix between like historically Africa and Russia. Incredibly resource rich area with um, a huge ethnic diversity of peoples across thousands of kilometers, but a lot colder. So instead of there's a very mineral rich, not sort of banana republic type esque things, but more like oil republic type things. Except that wouldn't happen for much. At the time, they were mostly interested in the iron and the coal, especially during the later years of that colonialistic imperialistic part of their history. Um, I'm summarizing a lot here. They literally sent us, I think it was like 20 to 30 terabytes of just written works. So which I've read all of. Um it was a long 50-year journey, and I got to do something. Um uh and once that was established, there were basically three main superpowers, what we would consider superpowers. Not to go into details, but basically based off of ideological differences, which I to gloss over some stuff. A First World War esque situation when once they had the aeroplane, like within the first 10 to 20 years of them having the aeroplane, there was no conflict. Um, at least not between the major superpowers. Planes were not really used for this purpose. And then within about, because that's a good gauge, right? Because the First World War happened 11 years after the invention of the airplane, of the aeroplane. Their first major conflict, and really their first World War, because at least in our history, it's like it can be argued that the 7 Years' War was the First World War or something like that. They didn't have any sorts of conflicts like that. They were too busy keeping to themselves because this continent was apparently large enough that, I mean, I don't know how they avoided that part of their history. Like for us in the Americas, I mean, it doesn't matter how big the continent was. There was wars all the time over New Amsterdam, or as you probably know, in New York. Um, these guys managed to figure it out. I don't know, like better deals, better communication, better diplomacy, kind of more like that bonobo-esque culture. Because their family, actually, quick side tangent, their family units were often four males and four females, and then the children that would be had between, because they would all intermingle, and eventually children would be had. Nobody knew who the parents. I mean, obviously by the end they had the technology to figure out whose was whose parent, but it was actually a social taboo to know exactly who your parent was. But and there was a whole rising movement of monogamous people, which is kind of like a, a weird parallel, a weird contrast to some of our history. Well, depending on the colony and the planet and our culture, I guess. There are some places in this universe now that are more similar to these people than uh, our old families back on Earth would have been. But oh yeah, so the problem was, since they didn't have that, at least in my hypothesis is, the problem was they didn't have that First World War type conflict. So when that Second World War type conflict happened, which was within 50 years of their invention of the aeroplane, the development of the atomic bomb was not as prevalent. So they had fission reactors that were powering like cities before they had the nuclear weapons. But when the first nuclear weapon was developed, um, I guess just a mix of ill wills or something, or um, based off of the documentation that I've read, even they're not entirely sure how exactly it happened. But they basically had one society get particularly paranoid, particularly authoritarian, and particularly weird. I basically they had their own version of our Soviet Union. Only as for terms of ideology, um, and economics, I I honestly couldn't tell you because this nation was very secretive to the point of a fault in terms of historical record, and in the ensuing war that followed, not a lot of records survived from this period. Um, Crazily enough, though, we do owe that Soviet Union type of civilization for the records of all the history prior to that, which means scarily enough that it's really really biased. Now we can of course because these people were so paranoid and were so sure of this global nuclear apocalypse happening, they kept massive databases buried deep underground, and that's where most of the civilization's data comes from before the first nuclear apocalypse. And if I haven't hinted at it enough yet, so basically they got to our 1970s ish level of technology. They of course had a moon, just like our own world. It seems to be that the moon, that hypothesis of like having a large object to stabilize the main body's rotation, does help with the rise of intelligent life. Apparently, who knew that a moon was basically like a given. But for intelligent life, if there's intelligent life on a world, there's a moon. So they had already been they hadn't gotten to their moon yet, but there were like obviously with the development of missile programs, and then all of a sudden there's a rush everywhere, there's development everywhere. They had I believe they had flown a flyby mission. They all, for sure there was like there's a name attached to the first of their people that entered orbit. So they definitely had explored space by this point. But as for like a moon base, there obviously was later. But at least at this time, there's not really sure, not really record. They never found anything. Um, at least in their later searches. So, and of course, the more paranoid Soviet Union-esque civilization claimed to have landed somebody on the moon, but there's no remaining evidence. And honestly, we'll get to it. But basically, nuclear apocalypse happens. Nobody knows who started it. Nobody knows exactly how long it went on, how many bombs went off. But unfortunately, unlike in our world where it was mostly concentrated in the northern hemisphere, which allowed places like Australia and South Africa and Brazil to rebuild the world in our reality, it was all over the world. No square inch of this planet was spared, unfortunately, because kind of a if you remember your middle American, I don't know how to explain. I mean, North American history is like its own thing, but you probably if you've read up on your North American history, you probably know about this country called the United States, right? So the United States had this one leader called Reagan. Um, you have no idea who I'm talking about, but basically during this man's term, it wasn't really his fault or anything, but that was when this United States superpower, like you probably know about the superpowers, at least the two superpowers that inevitably led to the states that would eventually result in our first nuclear apocalypse, kind of had like a war sort of. It was sort of a cold war. That's what they called it. They called it a cold war. Um, and they had that, and they had massive nuclear buildup, and then they decreased, and then afterwards they decreased their silo because of a political change in one of the nations. They decreased their silos, the volume of weapons that they had. But these nations did not. Kind of in that peak period, kind of a peak buildup, tension sort of rose, and everything came together. And just for them, whereas we got lucky during certain conflicts, and then not so much that one time, uh, this one they bit the dust on this one, just like we did in the 24th century. Um, so yeah, so first nuclear apocalypse. Of the three superpowers, obviously there were plans in place. A lot of their hierarchical structures survived. sort of. It's hard to describe. After the apocalypse, certain bases continue to exist. So sort of underground. So kind of like how we colonize worlds close to gas giants. You know how so quick gas giant colonization 101. Gas giants have magnetic fields, just like any habitable planet does. So, for example, Mother Earth, she's got a magnetic field. It protected life from the ultraviolet rays penetrating to, and the atmosphere also provided some protection. But okay, basically, without this magnetic sphere, life would not exist. I wouldn't be here talking to you. With as any Jovian or Saturnian will tell you, you gotta bury yourself pretty deep underground and then put yourself in a Faraday cage and then put yourself in another shield because that Faraday cage is also letting off a lot of stuff you don't want to deal with. So it's kind of ridiculous. Those people. Uh, I mean, if you ever want to read a good story that's like true, read up on the settlement of the Jovian system. It's inspiring, especially given that most of those people were organics. Sorry, I've been told to simmer it down, but I mean, who else? I mean, if you don't fight for yourself, there's gonna be nobody left to fight for you. Um, basically, yeah. So they have their nuclear apocalypse. And of the three nations, the super paranoid one does survive in certain outsets. So quickly within for the first like 50 years, it's basically impossible to inhabit the surface. Like there are some camps that basically revert to hunter gatherer stage, but all the knowledge remains in some respects. Like there are people that taught the knowledge does pass generationally, and within about 4 or 5 generations, there are settlements again. It's sort of weird. Like there's what's actually interesting is because of how difficult it was to get coal production up again and production up again. And because of how small the populations were, they were able to get by with renewable energy. So like solar panels and obviously in our history, renewable energy was pretty widespread, but it wasn't always the case. Like I said, in that sort of going back to I don't know why I keep going back to the United States. It's not really important. Um, but sort of the sort of that time in our history just before the during the early space age of our own history, renewables came after pretty much we'd almost destroyed the planet from mining for natural gas and oil and putting a bunch of CO2 in the atmosphere. They did that partially and they did that to a great extent, but of course their war kind of overshadowed all of that. And by the time after 5 generations, the impacts were still happening, and obviously weather was a bit crazier, but nowhere near as bad as it got on Earth. And so by that point, they made the connection, and they're like, well, we're mining all this stuff anyway, and it's just like, this crazy weather is resulting in a lot of wind, at least in certain. That's a generalized statement, obviously, but they had renewable energy, which is cool. So interestingly enough, though, their civilization kind of fragmented. So from the three superpowers, over the course of the next 2 or 300 years following the hibernation period, they sort of spread out and splintered into like basically city states. So each city was sort of independent, and they were kind of happy just being alive, and there wasn't really too much of a desire to because nationalism did rise. Obviously, I mean, how do you get a global conflict without nationalism? That is one I don't see happening. And in their history says as much, basically the rise of nationalism, um, and stuff. And then so basically they basically decide nationalism is bad. But of course that doesn't last because eventually, you organize, you specialize, and trade agreements become more official, and places unite. But they kept their technological development pretty slow. There was a lot more controls in place. So they rebuilt to a point, and then developed their computer technology sufficiently enough to start launching missiles into orbit again, stuff like that. Over the course of about 500 years after the events of their apocalypse. Um, and then one of their observatories detected an asteroid. Yeah, it was headed straight for them pretty much, and this one was going to be fairly cataclysmic. So all the ordnance that had been released in their apocalypse now 500 years ago, um, this thing was going to be about 20 to 30 times more explosive. Um, which isn't, it's not like that much. It's not too crazy, like when you consider like what it could have been, because it could have been upwards of hundreds or thousands of times more deadly. But it was 20 to 30 times more deadly. But you got to remember, one of those things put them out of commission for 500 years. 20 to 30 times as powerful, even just hitting one point on the surface. Um, and unfortunately, they were able to detect this thing, but and they rushed the development of certain projects, but and stuff was in motion. If this had happened 50 years earlier, 50 years later in their history, they would have been fine. But unfortunately, no. So it impacted, but this time they were a lot more prepared. There was a lot more cooperation, organization, because basically they had gone through their first series of globalization. So one thing I didn't touch on earlier is when you had the three superpowers, they were all pretty good on their own, right? They didn't really interact and touch each other too much, besides minor skirmishes during their age of colonialism and imperialism. So there wasn't really a drive or a push to colonialism, because they all internally had enough resources. They basically, that zero sum game mentality continued on through their and probably was how, despite being so peaceful, resulted in that said nuclear war. Whereas now, as a new innovative idea, globalism had occurred, so they were able to pool their resources much better and survive a lot better. Unfortunately, a group of radicals sabotaged the main, because basically what happened is that they figured out where this thing was going to impact, and in a certain mountain range, which was going to be far enough away that it wouldn't be impacted by the tsunamis too much, they built a gigantic, and I mean truly gigantic, base. So it's kind of difficult to visualize. Like now we think, oh, they built a space that was like 50 cubic kilometers, for their entire civilization to kind of hide out in. And for us, it's like 50 cubic kilometers in an internal space. It's like, okay, so they built a new housing block, basically, right? But you got to remember, with their technology, this took them like 5 to 6 years. And it wasn't like all nicely paneled and everything and all put together. It was basically just a open, and it wasn't one solid space either. It was a bunch of tunnels, and like the largest open space is like maybe a cubic kilometer on its own. And they basically built half spheres, half domes. They had carbon fiber, but in its natal stages, like carbon fiber had been developed like maybe 40 years earlier. So it was mostly steel, which is kind of crazy, and and Pittsburgh concrete, which was it Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Ohio concrete. I don't know all the states slash countries slash nations of that period, but you know what I mean. With basically early information age materials, they built out this gigantic thing. But going back to those radicals, basically what they did is they kind of they both went into the organ. Basically, they believe that their species was meant to end. So especially after the apocalypse, they got down to about 100 breeding pairs. Um, Interestingly enough, early in human history, we got down to about the same number of people, close to, I think it was 100,000 years ago, 110,000 years ago, um, sort of about 75,000 years before we were at the same technological as these people in that I'm describing. Um, but yeah, they were like, oh, we were meant. They basically, those people that say that it'd be better off for the universe if all of humanity just killed itself, because the human race in its natural, the universe in its natural state would be prettier than any. Because I mean, about the documentation of the terrorist bombings on the first and second Dyson spheres, sort of stuff like that, kind of the same thing, but for the space. Or like, our species was meant to die, and we're going to die. So this gigantic structure, all these years of effort, and once they got like 99% of their goddamn population into this thing, um, it it just fucking the terrorist group fucking got rid of it. Now the reason we have any I they it was a mix of both nuclear weapons and just regular chemical explosives, just closing the mine shut. And you're like, didn't this thing have multiple openings? Weren't there safeguards? What about all this? It wouldn't have. There were certain key figures, even ones that were constructing, like they got in early. I mean, it was destined to fail from the beginning. In a way, you could say it's not a very hopeful story. But it's kind of this is going to continue. Um, I don't know. So basically, before the asteroid even arrives, by within a few days of the asteroid arriving, because they had to get everybody inside first, 99% of the population is already wiped out because they're all concentrated in one spot. Um, and then I'm summarizing here, but of the remainders, most of them want to stay behind. They want the asteroid to kill them because it's like, oh, we'll of course kill ourselves when this asteroid gets here, and most of them do. Um, and they're what's kind of crazy is of the mix of the ones that survive, they're anarcho primitivists. Um, and yeah, it's like what? Like how the hell did the anarcho primitives survive? It's like they lived out their fantasies. I don't know. Some of them actually managed to make it out. So after the asteroid impacts, and these people and unfortunately this time it's the exact opposite of last time, with the vast majority of the intellectuals murdered, and any like political minded or any like intellectually minded people on the side of those that thought they should kill themselves, or just anarcho primitives that were just a lot, as it turned out later, aligned with them just to get back to, because they wanted to use the asteroid as a means to go back to how things used to be. They were like they basically, to summarize it, anarcho primitivists are anarchists that prefer the primitivism. It's not really an ideology. It's just like they basically consider agriculture to be a mistake. Um, so they want to go back to before before the domestication of like grains and barley and stuff and flax and all that kind of thing. It's like I find it very hard to believe, especially from my perspective, just given that like we have we have we have anarcho colonists, like people that think we should all go back to Earth and like just hang out there. And it's like that doesn't make any sense. And then these people, can you imagine when we as a species, because we had these people in our culture too. I went back and researched this. We had anarcho primitivists in our species, and back when we were just all on Earth, they wanted to do the same thing for us. They had plans of like planned deindustrialization and like planned depopulations of like people living out their lives without having kids, and then getting the population back down to that five on Earth. For Earth, it was a 5 million people threshold. Um, Now, obviously, this wouldn't have worked, and it didn't work in this civil for it didn't work out for the anarcho primitivists, which can't say I'm apologetic to that. Uh, just because they had successes for a time. And by the way, the reason we have record of any of this is um, people like, I don't know, people caught on, unfortunately, very too late to stop the event from happening. Basically, the deaths had already started like the explosions had already started going off and stuff within their little habitat under that mountain. But a couple people like that had survived, that had like either survived, or this part of the story we're not too sure on. We're not sure exactly what happened. Maybe there was a sympathizer. Maybe there was even a sympathizer on the terrorist side. But basically all their knowledge, like one room of this whole giant mountain thing that wasn't even too far from the surface, actually had a surface entrance, but that was kind of hidden, and this was more it was a more classified area anyway. Survived. So all their history, all their knowledge is survived in one archive. And this archive was stored in kind of a mix between quartz and laser sort of stuff, and was designed, and basically the system was designed to last close to, like it had a life expectancy of like thousands of years. Honestly, uh, given it was in an area without earthquake. It was an area without earthquakes. Oh, the best comparison is so the Svalbard seed vault, which every child learns about. Everybody learns about the Svalbard seed vault. That the Svalbard seed vault. That was a single reason that humanity survived, uh, after our nuclear apocalypse. It was the Svadbal seed vault. They unfortunately didn't have the foresight to build one of those on their own, but they did do one for kind of just their history, and for all their knowledge, basically. And it was designed to go from like absolute basics, like so, like somebody could walk in there with just with unfortunately some knowledge of the language, which is why it took them so long after the factory build. So they had to first translate it first, but luckily there was a lot of tools and like they basically they knew it was like it was a possibility. So it's like it's a linguistic and symbolistic, and it just it's it's perfect. Because obviously they eventually became a museum later on. Way we're getting ahead of ourselves, but it became a museum, and I have photographs of the thing, and it's like it's a marvel. It's literally it's just a marvel of everything. It's amazing. It's inspiring, and frankly, just I mean, it makes me very emotional thinking about it. Back to the terrorists or the anarcho primitivists. Um, they there was a couple thousand of them that survived. Most of them did move towards the impact point. So most of them were wiped out. Um, of the fringe, obviously not everybody made it into the base. There were a couple people left behind, a couple people that just wanted to die. Unfortunately, most of these people we don't really know much about. They archaeologists uncovered their remains hundreds, well, actually thousands of years later. Um, basically, so far, just for context, we've only gone over 5,000 years of their history. And you might be thinking, well, then I said there was 8,000 years of their history. Now it was kind of a straight line path. Well, I apologize. I was summarizing a little bit in the beginning there, because like I said, kind of scatterbrained, kind of still absorbing everything that's happened. Um, yeah, so it's kind of funny to think about how like in human history it took us close to 13,000 years before we got to our own apocalypse, and then luckily we never had an asteroid come and wipe us out. These people got got their nuclear apocalypse, and then were nearly wiped out a second time by an asteroid, all within 5,000 years from the invention of agriculture. Speedy, studious little guys. Well, they're definitely not little. I mean, compare they're about our height, kind of. I mean, their tallest people are kind of like how our shortest pure biologics. Um, the few of us that remain. But yeah. Uh, so the surviving people, there were most of them died out. There was really only one group that survived, um, and unfortunately, it was made up of a majority of these kind of anarcho-primitivists. Um, and the only reason we know anything of them is because of oral history. Basically, for what was determined to be about 600 years, they continued pretty well. With the first 600 years, we don't know very well because writing just hadn't been invented again yet. Um, but basically, there's ruins, right? There's ruins everywhere. These people specifically picked a spot that had previously been used as like a large. It was a good like 10 to 11% of their planet's land mass area had been reserved for this nature preserve. Um, as I told you earlier, they were able to. Their scientists after the nuclear apocalypse were able to determine that this thing called climate change happened. So we need this a giant amount of trees to absorb CO2, which just in case, because obviously as they were rebuilding, not everything could be based off renewables. They still had airplanes and stuff like that, um, which sorry, airplanes that weren't like because battery density is there's a reason it took humanity close to 400 years to fully adopt renewables, and it's because of battery density. And these people did not have time to develop that, unfortunately. So their aeroplanes and a lot of their architecture and their rockets that they were using were all still based off of, well, obviously rockets, because the propulsion based rockets that not even nuclear fueled, just chemically fueled. Like we're talking like an ISP of anywhere between like maybe 3 and like 400 at best. I know, kind of. Mm. Uh, but yeah, so these people lived in this kind of nature preserve area, which happened to be on the opposite side of the planet, and it's how they went so long without encountering technology. Because obviously, this generation of survivors this time was like purposely not telling their children anything. Like obviously, sometimes stories got out. There were some deathbed confessions, but these were myths and legends. but then about 600 years later, a group of studious people leave, and this group becomes to be known because they go into the cities, they discover writing, and actually teach themselves how to write based off of textbooks they found in their equivalent of an elementary school. For those of you that aren't aware, schools are where people used to drop off their children. Not everybody used to be homeschooled or have their own personal Aristotle. People used to be dropped off to a building. It was mostly a daycare, but it was also where students were designed to be like educated. And so they had these sort of institutional structures called elementary schools, because elementary, it's sort of a combination of just the basic elements, sort of a play on words, I think. Um, and in these institutions, these children would learn, obviously. So there were some books, like that were, oh man, I'm jumping ahead of myself. I completely forget. I don't know who knows what a book is and who doesn't. It's it's a, it's like, wood. Some people still use prefer to use wood in their homes. They call themselves, like, they love that traditional architecture. If you slice it thin enough and put a bunch of it together, instead of having print on an electric screen, you can use physical, what's called ink, to print it on the page. Um, and then you can have like 400 or 500 or sometimes more of these together in like one thing, and then you would just bind it together, and you could read it. So that's how it survived. Some of these were locked away, and it's like, how they not suffer environmental degradation. A lot of them did. So it was actually miraculous that some survived. But some of these books were designed to teach young children how to read. So very quickly, these explorers learned the alphabet, learned how to read, and then learned how to write, came back, introduced this stuff. And of course, it was by this point, 600 years later, it's like a taboo. It's like a rule not to read, obviously. And obviously there's this major split, but this doesn't continue for much longer, because so after the 600 years, they sort of rebuilt. It happens very slowly though, because in the reading, they discover that, like, oh, there were these things called nuclear weapons, and that was what caused the end, right? What they don't know, unfortunately, is like none of these books included the asteroid. And most of that stuff was digital. Most of that stuff was on their internet. And like, it didn't, like, very few print, like, there were still newspapers, which is like the little books but paper big, that you sent out tens of thousands of copies. You sell, so capitalism, remember. And then you sell this to a mass market. So there's a bunch of newspapers. There was mentions of the asteroid, but these people unfortunately didn't have really record of it for the first 1,000 years, because everything became about this nukes. It's like, oh, so our ancestors designed these weapons that destroyed us, and then our parents were actually trying to stop us from reading and writing because they didn't want us to evolve technologically to a point where this happens again. So they agreed to not technologically evolve. Now, obviously, that doesn't work, because either for some advantage, anybody's gonna be fighting over stuff. But it was mostly put down. They had their equivalent of our dark ages, but not for any sort of religious reason. At least not state. I'm sure there was some spiritual, religious, like social. There was at least a sociological, like, societal belief that was like, hey, let's not develop technology. Let's get to a point where everybody's comfortable. So what's really, it resulted in what we would consider very stratified. Like, these people had combines, solar powered combines, but they didn't have personal vehicles, or like trains, or public transit. It was like it's very strange. Like, their farming technology was sometimes like a generational break, because they like, when they were able, because as they kept exploring and kept mining, they eventually found some old, like, military bases. And luckily, most nukes had already been destroyed during the second after the nuke at the second rebuilding. Excuse me, this is the second rebuilding. The first rebuilding, the second rebuilding, or the second time civilization got started back up again. Most nukes had been destroyed, and there was a huge non-proliferation treaty just around the global one, again, that globalization. So the second time around, there was none of these weapons left for one guy, for one crazy person, one psychopath to use. Interesting how psychopathy is inherent to intelligence. I'm sure sociologists will be arguing over that for millennia. Um, Sorry, but sorry, I'm not sure what's going on. Sorry. If I seem a little on edge, I'll explain. I'll explain why I'm a little on edge. In addition to being, I'm a bit more. Hopefully a bit more, a bit better now. A bit, just because this kind of stuff makes me exciting. I just hate where it's going. Um, so after the second rebuilding, they kind of keep it slow. So agriculturally they're great. And they kind of, it's so strange to have it, like, obviously, in we're so used to, like, well, once you develop this tool, it makes it easier to make this tool, and then those two, and then it's so that they kind of pigeonholed. They were very meticulous in their development. Like, stuff had to get, like, it was very, very meticulous and dogmatic. Because they really, really did not want the world to end again, and because it's like, oh, it's our fault. So it's almost like, if you ever heard of the religion Christianity, where everybody was just like, you were born a sinner, that sort of thing, which, as we later learned, was not healthy. I'm not sure how billions of people got by living like that. It's kind of psychologically just destroying and result in a lot of mental health issues. But um, they felt like everybody was born a sort of technological sinner. Like, everybody had it in them to invent something that could destroy the world, which is very strange. It's like, everybody has potential, everybody has genius, which is what we treasure as our species. But this was not treasured. It's like, hey, you like smart people were employed and honored in, like, pursuing specific fields and avoiding other fields, which is kind of how this culture arose, of like, and how technology was pigeonholed and and not at all stratified. So that's how the agriculture was great. It's like, that was something that they were able to communicate and argue, at least that's something that was a necessary evil. It's like agriculture, right? Which is quite an interesting thought. And I don't know of any civilization in our world that thought of it like that. But yeah, so they had combines, they had silos, they had a lot of stuff. They were obviously limited in some respects. They weren't able to make genetically engineered crops or anything. But even to I mean, think of it like an industrial at an industrial scale. Just modifying crops generationally. Slowly, it takes a couple hundred years to get exactly what you want. But it works. It's just slower than with Casper. Or sorry, Cas9. Uh, eh, no, my world calls it Casper, because it's like the little ghost that. Never mind. Nobody cares about my world. But basically, uh, yeah, this of course obviously did not last, because eventually other people start, like, well, this industrial application can obviously be just used like this, or it's like the machining of parts, assembly lines, and all that kind of thing. And now, like, the knowledge was curiously not, it depended on where you were, but knowledge was not really too forbidden. So people was just like, well, this assembly line was used over here in the manufacture of this type of deal, and actually this would really help our civilization. It's like, yeah, but that's getting on the edges, that's getting on the fringes of developing nuclear weapons again. So unfortunately, uh, they did develop, and stuff eventually, stuff, like, as it happens, became generational. So at first there would be one society that would adopt a advancement, like indoor plumbing, or indoor electricity for the purposes of use, not in agriculture. Yeah, it's pretty interesting, right? It's like, what the fuck. But not in the use of agriculture, but like, oh, like, well, for indoor heating, like, obviously when winters are super cold, and obviously a coal fire does just as well. But um if we do electrical heating, electrical stoves, and sort of, it just kind of was just like, well, this is a necessity. This technology is a necessity. We need to be allowed to construct this. We need to be allowed to use these blueprints. And especially as the centuries went on, and a bunch of this knowledge started to be destroyed, like just not through anybody's fault. Like, sometimes through people's fault. Some people would go out of their way to destroy stuff. But other times it was just that organic degradation, and a lot of the paper stuff. And even the people that did eventually learn how to utilize computers again in these old abandoned military bases, a lot of that infrastructure was breaking apart. So they had to be like, well, in order to keep this knowledge for future generations, we have to learn how to build computers. And I think they use this and this, and then here, boom, I found it in this book. Here's a transistor, and then shortly after, here's the integrated circuit. And within about, so it was a lot slower, unfortunately. Within about 2,500 years, which is, so it was relatively successful, if you can define it as success. It was relatively successful. The anarcho-primitivists really slowed down progress of development for these people, which I hope they're happy with. And so it took about 2,500 years before they got back to where they were during just before the asteroid hit, which is great, right? Because there's 3,000 years of history left, so we're almost caught up to the present. Well, we're almost caught up to when the probe launched, which is not the present. Like, as I said, it took the probe, we're estimating, between 30 and 40,000 years to pass by our system. And not even pass by. It was actually, the more I look at it, the more it looks like it was sent directly to the star system that my world's from. And my guess is they detected, like, during those 500 years, they detected that this world was inhabitable, and they probably sent out their own probes. But actually, we did send out scouts, and we did, to see if they launched anything the equivalent to, like, the Voyager program. But not that we found. So just this Von Neumann-esque probe that was sent to our system with all their database and knowledge and stuff. It's a shame it wasn't self-replicating. Would have been, or it had some intelligence, but what you're gonna do? I'm sure they ran out of time. Basically, this is when we can say for sure they landed on the moon, because there was record and, like, video, and I presume archaeological evidence of what would have been archaeological evidence on their moon, of them, like, exploring the moon. And yeah, they actually got pretty far out. So so, as we're also aware now, most worlds with life have a gas giant in the system. It's about 80%, but strangely enough, multicellular life does require that gas giant. So their gas giant, they had already sent probes out to it, and they're actually exploring it up about within 200 to 300 years of having caught up to their predecessors. And there wasn't really a point. There wasn't like a celebration. There wasn't like a, hey, here's, like, we're now as good as we were before. Until during this time, about 100 years before they launched the probe, they discovered the old remember that last thing that was saved, that last database of all their knowledge that was supposed to last thousands of years. It did, luckily. So 2,900 years after it was constructed, it's discovered. And then that was, so 400 years after they caught up to, I'm just, like, I'm marking the point where they caught up, because this is when new technology starts, like, they obviously noticed. It's like, oh, we invented this thing. Like, this isn't something that we knew of before, or had heard of, or was in a book, or something we were trying to prevent from getting made. This is something we have invented and we've made. And obviously there was a lot, that's why, you think, like, oh, they've reached, the early 21st century, so they're not that far from the singularity. It's like, not quite, because whereas in our timeline everybody was complaining about AI taking over the world, obviously, I mean, it wasn't going to happen either way, but in our civilization, nobody cared. It's like, this is gonna, like, an AGI would bring huge economic benefit. Just capitalism again. If you, I don't believe I need to explain capitalism, because that would be another hour. A lot of history that's very deadly and very brutal, and yeah, there's a reason the capitalistic system was not used after the first nuclear apocalypse. I say first, like it's gonna be the only one. Well, first and only for Earth. But yeah, that's beyond the scope of this video. Basically, so that's how it took 400 years for that sort of area to get developed. They were very close to it, but interestingly enough, at the same time as they were colonizing their gas giant's moons, I assume in the same vein of stories, just like our Jovians were happening and super inspirational stuff. Like, that's the thing that bothers me the most, is that each of these, like, these were lives. Like, over the course of these thousands of years, we're talking about tens of billions of individuals. Maybe even close to 100 billion individuals. Like, that's a lot. That's a lot of people. It's just crazy to think about. I mean, obviously nowadays, I mean, for us, it's like, I think there's close to a quintillion minds out there, like right now. Like 90% of the organisms, 90% of intelligent minds that have ever existed, that have ever stemmed from our world, are alive right now, which is freaky to think about. Um, but I mean, come on, like still like, I mean, some of you out there are actually able to grasp the number like 100 billion. So for those of you that are unable to, because 100 billion versus a quadrillion is just like whatever. It's like a quadrillion is a billion billion. So for each individual that uh, for each individual that existed in this civilization, there was like there's a billion of us. So it's a small amount of people, right? But it's still like it's an insane scope. It's tens of billions of people is still a huge amount. Um, and I mean it's hard to wrap your mind around. Um, just individual lives, individual stories, and so kind of as I guess in the main vein of the story, and the thing I've been holding off on, and the thing that and the reason I'm getting kind of depressed again, is so. So they reached a technological level of space exploration where they're doing stuff. They're mining their asteroid. They're exploring their system. It's kind of great, right? They can now easily deflect any asteroids that are headed their way. There are no asteroids headed their way, however. However, there was a rogue black hole headed their way. And of course, these things are very difficult to detect. So they detected it when they had about 100-ish years remaining before it was going to swing by their system. It's like, first of all, what are the odds of an asteroid hitting them, like their world, like a continent destroying asteroid hitting their world within like a short time span of 12,000 years, or sorry, 8,000 years. I'm confusing with our own history, but a black hole, a rogue black hole. This, by the way, we did actually track this thing down. It's still out there somewhere, and it was 800 solar masses. So, and their star is a bit smaller. So this thing was like like 1,000 times the mass of their orange dwarf. And it was going to swing not only not only close to, not like within a tenth of a light, like a light month or something. It was going to swing right by the their inner star system. Like that's bad news, because for those of you that don't know orbital mechanics, which there are a few of you that exist, you take a pink, like just this pinky. This is one pinky, right? Pinky weighs one pinky. Not a surprise. Yes, this is a dangerous flesh pinky. You could probably crush it in 3 seconds. I'm sure that's exactly where your minds went, you fucking cyborg solid motherfuckers. But one pinky, right? And then you at least know how gravity works. Gravity attracts or stuff. I mean, we're still trying to figure gravity out, which is kind of crazy. But you got a gravitational attraction, right? Now you take something that's 100 times that. So 100 weighs 100 times that, but it's far smaller. Like not even, it's not a comparison I can make, because if my pinky is representing their star, the black hole is, I mean, it's not visible on the scale. Like not even 1 pixel on this video, probably big enough. It weighs 100 times more though. So imagine, you're orbiting around your little star, no problem, and then this force comes in that weighs 100 times more, that's pulling you towards it. And it did this for the entire system, right? But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. So they know that like within 100 years, this is going to be like at its closest point. So they're going to be suffering from the effects decades earlier than that. So, and what's worse is based off the orbital stuff like this, it's going to pass by at one end of the star, right? Within 2 astronomical units. That is ridiculous. And then they're orbiting at about 0.7 astronomical units away from their star. But so you think so it's not even like it wouldn't be that far away. Like you think at best they'll be close to 3 astronomical units away. At worst, within like pretty much 1 astronomical unit away. They're within 1 astronomical unit away when this thing comes by. They are this world. This world is gonna have its goddamn plates ripped off, like its tectonic plates. Those like things that like even in the tens of thousands of years that have gone by Earth, and we've seen like tiny changes, and it's like, oh, this river's gone, or like this, but they mostly remain solid since the first cartographers went out and explored our oceans tens of thousands of years ago. Those things are just gonna be peeled off essentially. Like their world is not exactly, because it's not going to be like peeled off the surface, because it's going to result in a lot of stuff. You know, like Io, for example, going back to our friends out there in the Jovian and Saturnian systems, Io has a lot of volcanic activity. The only other place in our home system that has volcanic activity currently. Um, Not that has ever had, but is currently having like right now. Like you can go like take a couple 100-year vacation, go to Io, see the only active volcanoes in our star system outside of Earth. The reason that's happening is because Io is being pulled. It's being like squished in the middle as it's being pulled apart, because it's basically a giant sphere, right? It's a ball that one part is being like pulled at towards Saturn as it goes by, as it orbits, and that's why it is tidally locked to Saturn. Um, uh, and yeah, it's like, okay, so basically the core of the planet is being compressed and heated, and that's just Saturn. Now imagine something that weighs, uh, I think it'd be, because Saturn weighs 1/200th of our star, and this thing weighs 80 solar masses. So imagine something that weighs 24,000 times more. 24,000 times more. Um, at least I'm doing just the rough math in my head. I'm sorry. Look, most of you are connected to the net anyway. Just you do the math, right? And correct me on anything wrong I'm saying, okay? Sorry, my human brain can't keep up. My bio brain. Uh, Basically, the compression and the heat and the tectonic activity would result in the surface basically just becoming magma. The surface would become unstable. But long before then, when it's still far enough away, because obviously distance plays as much of a factor as gravitational as mass. Sorry, distance plays as much of a factor as mass and gravity, obviously. Um, Objectively, maybe, I don't know. Uh, it's gonna be bad, like decades before. Like decades before, your tectonic your earthquakes are going to be worse, and your tides are going to be worse, like even like years before. So you don't really have like it. I think they had about 120 years. um actually actually I know exactly how much long they had 120. They had like 123 years, if I remember correctly. I know, yeah. How does that happen? Like already commented on the odds. So they've got like essentially like 100 years before the stuff on their world gets so bad that they can no longer like inhabit it. So kind of like before, kind of in the same vein, a mass, like instead of focusing their efforts on building their Dyson sphere, which they were within 100 years of actually starting construction of Dyson sphere. Um, Again, what are the odds? It's like ridiculous. It's like these people are born to have bad luck. Um, they instead focus on all their efforts on building a generational ship. Just a massive craft. Um, and this thing was designed to hold like tens of millions of people. So obviously they couldn't save everyone, which is kind of sad. Like at least like before they were able to save everyone because but not this time. You know, it's like they had to choose, right? So luckily their automation at this point was good enough. They didn't need that many people. So a lot of people elected not to have kids. So but life extension was already beginning to happen around this time. So a lot of people did die. Close to 80% of their so they numbered in the tens of billions, but then close to 80% of their population just just died, right? Just of natural causes. They just elected not to have children. Of course, some people still elected to have kids and stuff, but it was because it's like, what's the point? It's like only not everybody's gonna be selected for this mission, but there were still about there are still about 4 billion people left over. Um, by the time this craft, which was designed to hold maybe 50 million at best, was constructed. So there were still a lot of people that were going to die. Um, a lot of people that did die. There's so they decided to send out like there was not a large guarantee that this station was going to work. Um, so station or so this generational ship was going to work. They were actually, and here's the crazy part is that they designated this craft. And here's the part. The reason I'm so depressed about this, and it's not like it's like, well, maybe they survived, maybe they're out there somewhere, maybe we can find them, maybe we can help them. Like, why are you so sad about this? It's because I know they didn't make it to where they were going. Because part of the data, because it. So, let me hold. Sorry. They launched the probe before they knew where they were going to send this thing. So when we got the probe to our world, we downloaded its entire database and translated it and stuff. We didn't know where their final destination was. They left another probe here in their star system. What was left of it. So yeah, as you could probably tell, in that last 20 years, everybody died. Nothing was really left of the system. Their world was just shattered, and it's actually not here anymore because it got flung out of the system, along with its moon. Though it looks like the moon crashed into the world at some point. Maybe. I mean, we're not entirely sure because we don't know, because the world is still currently lost. It's become a rogue planet out there in the abyss. And we have probes tracking it down right now, but it could take decades or centuries before we find it, and there wouldn't be much left. But in the star system, in close orbit of their orange dwarf, they left another probe, just in case, just a final goodbye. And so they sent the probe. The probe we got was one of several that were sent out. Several hundred thousand that were sent out to just let it was like we existed just out into the abyss. But they left one in their star system with the most up-to-date information, right? So because basically they had to send the probes out before, while they could still guarantee them not being caught and flung wherever the fuck by the black hole. So they were all sent out about 10 years before they sent out the ship. Yeah, they were building this thing, not sure where they were going to send it. Which is kind of crazy. But once the thing was constructed, they did find a location. And they found a system with a slightly larger star than theirs, with multiple gas giants, and a world that seemed habitable. And the mass of this world was 1 Earth mass, because it was Earth. So these people were planning to evacuate to Earth, to Sol. And this all happened 30 to 40,000 years ago. And this giant ship was designed to travel at 20% of the speed of light, which is the amount of they must have converted every last bit of hydrogen of their gas giant to this thing. Like, it's an insane mass. It's an insane equation to think about how much this thing weighed. Because even today, we've conceived of that's possible, but for this would have been a massive undertaking, requiring close to like half of their total energetic output at this point is a type 1.1 civilization. It's just a stupid amount. It's ridiculous to consider that they were able to pull this off. But yeah, so going at 20% of the light, 20% of the speed of light, 40,000 years, obviously, they either shot by Earth or didn't make it there, because Earth is only 3,500 light years from this world. So they should have made it there. They should have made it there about the same time we were discovering like we were discovering how to like farm basically, like at the latest, let's say, like they had to slow, like even let's say they had no way to speed themselves up, so they were slowing down, like at most the journey should have taken them maybe like let's give them benefit of the doubt, let's assume the journey would have taken them 25,000 years. They would have hit Earth. I'm about well if it took them 25,000 years, that's a little different. But no, I mean they would have, if the journey had taken them the what I'm assuming 12,500 years, they would have hit us right smack dab in the middle of the Bronze Age, which was 25,000 years ago from our vantage point. Um, and then if they had encountered us anywhere from 5 to 10,000 years later, well then there's no problem because then we would have been able to handle it, right? Um, but it didn't happen. They never made it, and that means that their final effort, all that, this giant massive thing that they did to save themselves, it didn't happen. Well, it did happen, but like it was for nothing. Like their entire evolution, everything, like from the moment RNA to DNA to a single-celled organism to a multicellular organism to a creature which first had an idea on this world, all of it was for these people to end up a mystery out there somewhere in the expanse, kind of. I mean, we now know as of like 3 hours ago they were headed towards Earth. Um, but we don't know what happened to their ship, and oh my god, sorry, I'm recording this on a personal mobile phone, uh, just because I don't have one installed on my eyeballs like a fucking nut. So I just hold on a sec. So as of, sorry, this is a developing situation, obviously. It looks like their ship was transmitting stuff. Um, it didn't even we caught one of their transmissions, but that's not possible because it takes thousands of years. It would take thousands of years for light to travel. So that means it didn't even make it out of the system. It just their equivalent of a black. We just got their data from their equivalent of a black box, and it's saying that like one of the ejecta that from the asteroid belt, that was propelled by this black hole. Like despite all their best efforts, I mean they had massive engines on this thing. I mean this thing was massive. It didn't move very well very quickly, so they weren't able to avoid a collision with a asteroid, and all the air in their ship kind of just. It was a massive ship, massive scale. It took days for it to happen, but yeah, uh, they're extinct. The first intelligent species that we've ever even encountered, and we missed them by like what 25,000, like 30,000 years. Anyway, I'm gonna pause this video now and get it uploaded. I'm sure I'll get a couple trillion messages on my email that I won't be able to read, because most people will be able to watch this in my like 2 seconds. I mean, it'll take a couple thousand years for people to get this report anyway. So some people, my homeworld will get it, in just 10 years. But yeah, they were so close, man. Another 100 years, and they would have had the energy to like move their entire planet. Damn it. Damn it, you know? Okay. I gotta, obviously, I gotta go check out what's left of their ship. Um, I'm wondering if after tens of thousands of years, if there's not some of their corpses left perfectly preserved. Be interesting to actually see one of these things. Yeah. Gotta get back to work.